All right, so thank you everybody for joining me. What are we doing here today? Today is a chance for us to explore high impact practices, what they are, and then my favorite part is how students can become partners and allies in supporting these practices and helping their implementation. The reason I came up with the idea to have this summit, as we're calling it, this webinar, is really from my own role as a student leader. And I want to be able to use this to help other student leaders and students as a whole in their role. This year, as we're all well aware, the classroom is evolving, I'll say. It's not just changing, it is evolving. And I am very grateful that myself as a student leader, and I know many others, are heavily engaged in these discussions, in the committee work, and in all the feedback and planning going into this evolution. And it was about a month ago that I realized in the midst of all these discussions, I'm really not qualified to be giving all this feedback right now. So I need to really do my best to educate myself. What is the best educational experience? How do we advocate for solutions to student needs around accommodation and supporting their learning needs? And that has led us here. How do students become partners and allies in supporting high impact practices and bringing those into the classrooms on their campuses? So I'll go through and introduce our panelists here today. There are 5 of them, all very inspirational and intelligent practitioners of high impact practices, I'll say. And then after the introductions, they will each give a 5-minute piece on their position in high impact practices, and then we can go into a Q&A period. And I'll have some questions to start us off, but we really would like to have a discussion going, and so please feel free to chime in if you have any questions. So in order that they will be speaking in a few minutes, I will start with Tanisha. So Tanisha Campbell is, I'll read her bio. I'm not going to ad-lib this. Sorry. Tanisha Campbell's humble journey begins at Vanier College in 2011, where she obtained a diploma in animal health technology and worked as an animal nurse for 2 to 3 years. She was offered admission in 2013 at Bishop's, double majoring in modern languages, which is international Japanese studies and Hispanic studies, and as well as psychology. For the 2014-15 term, Tanisha was the first ever Canadian student to attend Tokushima University in Japan through the International Exchange Program. With this opportunity, she spearheaded an art and cultural exchange project and was awarded with the McConnell Student Opportunity Fund from Bishop's University. Tanisha's photographic exhibition and cultural exchange initiatives were hosted at 2 of Tokushima's sister cities, Leiria, Portugal, as well as Jelgava in Latvia. The reality of being a first-generation student had hit hard, and so Tanisha returned to her hometown in Montreal after the exchange due to fiscal limitations, and then transferred to Concordia University for fall 2015. There she matriculated with a psychology specialization and minor in First People Studies in 2018. Fueled by intrinsic motivation to do more and to complete her original focus in modern languages, Tanisha has returned to Bishop's University and is now in the process of disseminating knowledge and advocating for accessible, affordable, and high-quality education through Bishop's University's Graduate Certificate in Knowledge Mobilization. Next up, we have Tiffany. Tiffany MacLennan is a strong advocate for a higher education that is accessible, affordable, and of the highest possible quality. Through the McKenna Fellowship, Tiffany is working with the Maple League of Universities to continue her pursuit of this goal. Tiffany struggled through the barriers of being a first-generation student at her campus, especially during her first 2 years. Over time, she used her leadership roles as the VP Academic Affairs for the St. FX Student Union and as a board member for the St. FX Board of Governors to advocate for a more inclusive education. Tiffany now holds 2 degrees from St. FX University and continues to create pathways and supports for other first-generation students. With the Maple League, Tiffany is focusing on removing barriers to high-impact practices for first-generation students in hopes of increasing first-generation retention and participation rates across Santa Fe's, Acadia, Mount Allison, and Bishop's University's campuses. Dr. Jessica Riddell is a full professor of early modern literature in the English department at Bishop's University and is specializing in early modern dramatic and non-dramatic literature. Dr. Riddell was awarded the 3M National Teaching Fellowship in 2015, the first recipient of the award at Bishop's University and the youngest recipient in the National Award's 34-year history. She holds the Stephen A. Jaroslawski Chair of Undergraduate Teaching Excellence at Bishop's University. In this capacity, she explores innovative teaching and learning practices, creates mentorship opportunities for students and faculty, and participates in a wide range of consultations at the national and international levels. Dr. Riddell is also the executive director of the Maple League of Universities, a consortium of 4 universities, Bishop's, Mount A, Acadia, and Santa Fe's, that share a focused commitment to quality undergraduate education. She works across the 4 universities to support high-impact practices as part of a 21st century liberal education. She engages in public-facing activities and projects, including as an active contributor to public scholarship through her work as a columnist for University Affair magazine, as a keynote speaker at international conferences, and sits on a number of international boards, including the Future Skills Research Advisory Board, Social and Emotional Skills, VP Canada for ISSOTL, the International Society of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, a member of the Future Skills Talent Council, and as a member of the 3M National Teaching Fellows Executive Council. Krista Steeves, one of our final speakers, is the Director of Experiential Learning and Career Development at Mount Allison University. In her role at Mount A, she works with students and faculty to culture authentic experiential learning opportunities that incorporate reflection and help students make connections between what they are studying and the world around them. In addition to being part of the Maple League, Mount A works with the 4 other public universities in New Brunswick to support the Future NB program that places a focus on experiential learning in the province. She has worked in the post-secondary environment for over 23 years and has held a variety of positions in student life and worked on 4 different university campuses. Krista is a Mount A grad with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Anthropology, and as well as holding 2 master's degrees from the University of Toronto, one in higher education policy and one in counseling and psychotherapy. Last but not least, we have Heather Carroll, our director of the Maple League Teaching and Learning Center, which was recently formed. She holds a Master's of Learning and Teaching from Harvard University and a Master's of International Higher Education from Loyola University, Chicago. In addition to her role with the Maple League, she serves both Canadian and international teaching and learning communities as the Director of Communications for the Council of 3M National Teaching and Learning Fellows and the Operations Manager of the International Society of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Fellowship. These will be our panelists today, and now I will put it over to them to do a brief 5-minute introduction on high-impact practices and experiential learning from their perspectives.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to screen share, hopefully in 3, 2, 1. You can all see what I'm sharing. Any thumbs up? I can only see Jessica Riddell's face. Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name's Tiffany, as was mentioned. I'm going to talk to you really briefly, and my timer is set, about the benefits of high-impact practices for students. So there's a variety of high-impact practices, and it's kind of, I'm going to base the framework for what we're talking about over the next few speakers and throughout the rest of the conversation. So high impact practices are learning practices that promote a deeper level of learning by promoting student engagement. So there's 11 different high impact practices, and I have them up on the screen in front of you. And so they range all the way from, bringing together first years and different experiences up to undergraduate research, global learning, service learning. They really span a really far scope of different educational practices. So what makes a practice high impact? I listed 3 quick reasons. And what really it comes down to is that high impact practices give students an opportunity to work closely with faculty, staff, and their peers on different topics such as undergraduate research, for example. It allows students to apply their education outside of the classroom, but then on top of that, it also gives students the opportunity to recognize that their education is applicable in many other different fields. And then the third that I have listed is students get frequent feedback on their performance. So one of the things that comes out of it is that when you're doing things like, I use research as my example very often because it's the one I'm most accustomed to. When you're doing research almost 24/7, you're in constant communication and you're getting feedback on your performance and what you do. But some other things that also fall into this is ensuring that students are doing work that makes sense for them. So if you're doing a different high impact practice, you want to make sure that the level of, difficulty meets what you need. So if you're an English student and you're trying to do brain surgery, or chemistry student trying to write a book chapter, in my case right now, there's going to be things that are really difficult, and you want to try to make sure that the high impact practice keeps you within a comfort zone, puts you a little bit out of it so that you have opportunity to grow as well. So there's a lot of benefits that come from participating in the 11 high impact practices that I had listed on the very first slide. And for kind of a student standpoint, there's some really big ones, and they come down to increased GPA. At St. FX, we just have averages. We don't have a GPA scale, but I'm sure across the other 4 schools, there probably is a GPA scale. So increased GPAs, you increase faculty-student interactions, which provides a variety of really great opportunities, from being able to create connections to learning from the profs, and then having a network when you come out of university as well. Because when you are able to create a kind of a network and support system within university, you're able to kind of fall back on it a little bit more once you get out into a different world and you need reference letters, or you need maybe just someone to get you to shake hands with the right person. Students report when they participate in high impact practices that they feel more support and feelings from faculty. Like I mentioned, the more you can create a connection, the better impact you're going to have. Increased student engagement, which is really great from an institutional level, but great from a student level as well, because when we participate in different activities, we gain a lot from it. It increases deeper learning, which is a national student survey, which basically encompasses different engagement levels on campus. And it has compensatory effects, which basically just means the more high impact practices you participate in, the more positive outcomes that you're going to get from participating in them. So when we talk about all these different practices, if you participate in 1, that's great. You're going to learn a lot. If you participate in 2, you're going to learn more. 4, 5, 6, 11, if you're really a go-getter, which I'm going to tell you, that's going to be really hard. But if you participate in more, the more positive outcome you're going to get. And then the last one that I have in stars there is students from underserved backgrounds receive the greatest benefits. So students who are low income, Black, Indigenous, in the case of American studies, are Black students, Hispanic students, and first generation students. Those people who participate receive the most positive impact from participating. So we brought together this panel, as Brendan mentioned, for a variety of reasons, but a different one too is that we're currently doing research on high impact practices at the 4 Maple Leaf universities. So we're discussing 3 main questions. So what are high impact practices and who has access to them? What are the aspirations for growth of high impact practices at departmental, institutional, and individual levels? And how do high impact practices positively impact underserved students in the Maple Leaf universities particularly? So over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking into this a little bit more. Some really interesting stats have been coming out of CASA, for example, the Canadian Alliance of Students Association, which are showing data that 75% of students believe that COVID will impact their employment long term, and 65% believe that online hybrid learning does not offer the same opportunities as in class. So what we're really looking at is how do we embed high impact practices into our universities and courses to increase the quality and impact of online and hybrid learning, and how to help students gain the skills and confidence to succeed in a post-COVID job market. So if you want to help us out in our research over the next few weeks, please feel free to reach out, and I will pass it on to Tanisha.
Hi, everyone. All right, thank you so much, Tiffany. I'll try to screen share real quickly what I have here. All right, so my approach will be more focusing on how we would actually implement these HIPs, so high impact practices. And I kind of devised a little KMB cheat sheet based on what I recently learned. So just to go over it really quickly, I have it all written here, but I'll read through it with you. So having a clear idea in your mind as to what information should be mobilized to each representative. So our student leaders, I imagine you guys may be working really closely with certain individuals. So having a clear idea of what it is that you want to get across to them is something that you will need to make sure that you have. And there are several leaders across the 4 universities. So you may want to delegate and have one person kind of go through all 3 of these steps that I'm going to show you from start to finish, just to keep one point of contact. And so that would be the first step. Having that in mind, you also want to keep in mind what is the broad picture. So creating a shared brainstorming board on the overarching ideas that you will want to share, and keeping careful consideration of the different barriers and obstacles that you might encounter is another step. So when you have, let's say you have a professor who disagrees, or they've always been doing something in one particular way, you can kind of bring this problem to your group and say, hey, I'm having this issues. I thought of this solution, but what do you guys think? So really just bouncing ideas off of each other. So that touches on being solution oriented. Then, of course, with the HIPs in mind, you also need to keep your target audience. Those would be the students, the undergraduate students, the first generation students, the marginalized, and so just really keeping in mind how these changes will impact them, because it will kind of fall a bit on a spectrum. So you have your students in mind, but you also have the representatives that you're going to be working with. And as you go through the first few steps, you may fall somewhere in the middle. You might not get it directly. And having the target in mind, the professor or the representative may say, well, I prefer to do things this way. And that slider, as you change your plan, that slider might move a little more to the left. And so you just need to keep that in mind as you change your product or your ideas. And that also touches on the 4th step. When delivering your ideas in your products, each policy or decision makers, be sure to have the personalized information for the person in the role. So here it's a little more time consuming, but it is very important to build a rapport if time permits, but to make sure that you engage in active listening so that you can modify your product accordingly. So be flexible and open. And yes, so that is essentially KMB, knowledge mobilization, being able to bring your information to the right people at the right time in the right format. And that may come in the form of a report or a presentation, whatever you feel is most appropriate based on who it is that you're going to be communicating with. And so I'll pass the floor over to, I believe, Jessica.
Thanks, Tanisha. And thank you to Tiffany and Tanisha for giving us a really good overview, first, of what high impact practices are, and then second, how to get the word out about high impact practices. So depending on who you are, I think there's a really nice mix today of administrative leaders, students, and faculty. So depending on who your audience is, who you want to convince, you're going to use some of those principles that Tanisha really helpfully puts in an infographic. And I love that emphasis on listening and being able to adapt and to be responsive to your audience's needs, but to also target your audience to go to where they are and to communicate the value, in this case, of high impact practices. So for the students who are joining us, welcome. You will be in many ways mentors and collaborators and even advocates for the integration of high impact practices into your classrooms and into your learning experiences. And to be able to know that those opportunities are available is the first step. And the second is to engage and to share your experiences with others. And for faculty who are here, many of you, I see your names, are really, you've drunk the Kool-Aid, you have integrated high impact practices into your classrooms in creative and wonderful ways. And I hope that we'll be able to have some time for your voices and your examples and case studies as we inspire one another to be brave. As Tiffany says, COVID changes the context. High impact practices are often happening in face-to-face environments, and they're often happening on one-on-one. So if you think about undergraduate research, for example, and that constant feedback, sometimes you're side by side in a lab. And so the context of COVID changes the conditions slightly. So we have to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more intentional about these high impact practices. I'm here on the panel as a faculty member to provide a faculty lens to the conversation. And so I use high impact practices in my classes. I teach literature, intro to literature, Shakespeare, medieval drama, medieval literature. And so the ones that I use mostly in my classrooms are capstone projects, collaborative assignments, and writing intensive exercises. So those are the three high impact practices that show up almost in every single course. But I have to say that I did it accidentally at first. I was experimenting with my class and nobody was reading Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, this beautiful 17th century weird theodicy. It's the story of Adam and Eve and why they get kicked out of the garden, but it's in pretty unfamiliar language. And so I was really struggling with teaching it straight up. And so I decided to do something fun and shake it up. So I created the entire course as a trial where we put Satan on trial for crimes against humanity. So we set it up with an international criminal court, and we had teams of prosecutors and defense and advocates. And we went through the 12 weeks where we actually broke it up into a pre-trial. So we gathered evidence. We just determined whether or not there was enough evidence to bring him to trial for crimes against humanity. And then we went through and we actually built this courtroom where all of our witnesses were characters in Paradise Lost. And the students had to go in and pretend that they were Adam or Eve or Satan or Raphael or God. And we sort of did it in that way, which was really interactive and really dynamic. And the students were completely exhilarated, night and day from when I taught it sort of straight up as a seminar class to this trial model. And so I was hooked. It was more fun for me. It was more fun for the students. The students were meeting outside of class and having beers and coffees and like debating about whether or not Satan was guilty, or if it was Milton, or if God was the real culprit, or if Adam was a drip. Adam's a drip in Paradise Lost, spoiler alert. But really, how do you get something live and animated and create the conditions for deep learning? So I did it and I loved it, and I tried to do lots of feedback loops and lots of critical reflective assessment, but I did it because I wanted to shake it up, because I was brave, and because I trusted my students as this collaborative community. But I can say from the faculty perspective as well that there is a risk involved in doing these kinds of exercises. There are some students, and there's lots of research to back this up, that in fact students like or are more familiar or more comfortable with standard setups, right? Two midterms and a final exam, or 2 papers and a final exam. And so when you ask them to do things that are different, you sort of push them through this transformational experience, they're going to feel some deep discomfort, right? They're going to feel like, wait a second, I mastered this formula. You told me that if I can do 2 papers and a final exam, I know I can get a B, or I know I can get an A-. And so when you throw a monkey wrench into that, there is something called in transformational learning called threshold concepts, and you actually ask people to move through a threshold. And part of that process is feeling uncomfortable. It's feeling sort of a cognitive dissonance. It's feeling that this is alien and unusual, and it's asking you to think in different conceptual ways. So if you don't do it with design, and you don't do it in spaces that are brave, there's risk to the student being overly uncomfortable, but there's also a risk to the entire course getting off the rails. And so it's also risky for faculty members, especially junior faculty members or faculty members from marginalized or underrepresented groups, because you will already be penalized in teaching evaluations. A lot of research suggests that women, people of color, Indigenous scholars are already adversely affected by teaching evaluations, which are really important for promotion, evaluation, and review. So if you then change up your classroom and invite in these high impact practices without a lot of support and some really good design, you are, as a faculty member, also risking in that. So I just wanted to frame that from the faculty perspective, that there are sometimes barriers to innovation, right? Students are like, let's go play, let's go do these high impact practices. But to have a nuanced understanding and an empathetic design about the benefits, but also the risks associated. And I think the solution, one of the ways forward, is to provide support in the design of it, right? That I think Krista's going to talk about this a little bit, but experiential learning is not experiential learning unless it has intentional design and intentional alignment and intentional feedback and reflective practice. And so all of those things, I have to draw back the curtain a little bit and tell you that faculty aren't trained to do this in grad school. That if we know this because we're life learners and because we've sought it out, and we've sought it out because we believe in the deep learning of our students, but we're not trained to do it. And often we do it sort of on the side and in the margins. So from that faculty perspective, I think making sure we have a nuanced understanding of some of the opportunities, but also some of the barriers, is really, really important if we're going to make high impact practices more intentional and more embedded across our institutions. So Krista, I'm going to pass that baton on to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Jessica, thanks for sharing some of those words, because it's a nice segue into what I'm going to talk a little bit about. So we all know that we're living in the times of COVID, and it's kind of upset so many of us in our practices that it's giving us pause to reflect on how experiential learning kind of fits into education today. And so when I think about what Jessica shared, I think that it's important to understand in experiential education, what we're really talking about, key pieces are setting outcomes in your learning for the student and reflecting on the experience you have. And I think it was Tiffany who talked a lot about that constant reflection, that back and forth, and how that sometimes is where you learn and where the learning is. I think the important thing to also note is that it's not always comfortable. I think that's something about learning that we often forget, is that we need to have those moments of reflection. So I'm sure all of us in our teaching do a level of assessment, but do we reflect? Do we set our students up at the beginning of their learning to kind of reflect on what they're learning and to think outside of the box about how what they're teaching, what students are learning, is related to the world that we all exist in? You know, it's never been a more important time in education for students to have a liberal education where they're able to take the concepts that they learn and to reflect on those in their classes. So Brendan said something I want to touch a little bit on, and that is that the classroom is evolving. And I'm going to talk about that a bit from an experiential perspective. A lot of what we talk about, or one of the areas I work on, is work integrated learning, where students actually get some hands-on experience that helps to put their learning in context as they prepare to transition into the world of career. And I think that there's been some learning for us in the time of COVID about what we need to think about on a go-forward basis. One of the things that I think we need to talk about is flexibility. We haven't always been in a flexible world. The university hasn't always been a flexible place, but COVID has taught us that flexibility for learning and practice is very important. And that's one of the things that we learned this year from our own perspective is when we were putting our students into their placements this summer, there was no opportunity for everybody to come to campus on March 23rd to participate in training. So we had to throw that model out the window and start again with thinking about what would that training look like, designing how it would be impactful for students and where we would go from there. So I will confess to you, this past spring was a bit like survival mode. But I think it's been beneficial in the sense that we've been able to reflect on what we did and to pull out some of those pieces. And I think our program and many professors will transition what they're teaching, how they're teaching it, to put in place a structure that is learner-focused and client-centered. So that's something that we learned a lot. The other thing that we learned is that we weren't the only folks willing to be flexible when designing the learning of our students. Our employers were willing to work with us, our community partners were willing to work with us, and our students were willing to work with us in being flexible. I think that it's important to understand that there are barriers in the university to kind of experiential learning and shifting that mindset from the safety of the written essay to actual real life experiences that inform practice. And I think that is a mindset that we're working through as educators and as institutions. And I would put that out there to students to challenge us to think about what is the best service to you. So finally, the other piece I want to say that I think we learned in this model was talking a little bit about asking questions that we haven't asked in a long time. In education, we have our ways of doing things, but the question is, how do we ask questions to our partners and our students and ourselves that we haven't asked in a long time? What would serve you best? How do you learn best? What are the tools that are going to make you successful? And Tanisha's comment about listening. We need to listen to what we hear and the research that's done about how high impact practices need to kind of shift and transition to what is becoming a more digital world. So in saying that, I think at this stage, we are embarking on a bit of a research trajectory where we're trying to figure out where to move forward. But I think it's fair to say that the steps will be complicated, weighing the tried and true kind of approaches of the past while incorporating outcomes and reflection in the future. So we're focused on the learner. And I'll pass it over to Heather.
Thanks so much, Krista. And it was really great to hear about how we need to be in constant communication with community partners, especially when doing experiential learning, and how the shift has really affected everyone. Because I'd like to begin by just saying that COVID has really broken open what is possible, what works, and especially what doesn't work for students and student leaders. And I think it was very brave of our first two panelists to talk about their experience as first-generation students, because often those students are underserved by our institutions. And this, reshift or refocus on what's happening now gives us a chance and an opportunity to look towards high impact practices and how we can mold those in our current context to better serve all students. And I'm so proud of all the student leaders who are here today, because this is definitely an advocacy piece that you can ask of your institution. So high impact practices are the nexus between what's happening in the classroom, some of the student affairs pieces of recruitment and retention, but then also the learners themselves and what you'll get from your university experience. So now there's an opportunity to dive deeper and see how we can reimagine these high impact practices in a digital world, if that's what we're looking forward to for fall 2020. And first and foremost, with first generation students, they're often segregated on campus, and that could be due to socioeconomic status, but also the bridging and bonding capital that a lot of students come to university with, and then there's a stark chasm between those who have and those who have not. So as an institution, it's really within the institution's possibility and ability to make the playing field more equitable for all students through high impact practices. So I just wanted to share a couple of examples of how that could happen. As we know, like some of the high impact practices are really impossible for all students to reach, such as work integrated learning if you don't have the time, or study abroad if you simply don't have the money. So how can we take these opportunities and make them more accessible? So the first thing that came to mind was service learning. That often requires an incredible amount of time for students to participate in, but now we could use that and connect with nonprofit organizations anywhere in the world and allow students in the classroom to develop these technical skills such as grant proposal writing or just writing in general through working with a nonprofit that might not necessarily be located in your community or require a lot of time and effort to reach the service learning site. Another idea for writing intensive courses would be now that we have technology, we can put students in Zoom breakout rooms and really hone in on writing or any sort of craft in that regard. Undergraduate research, which we talked on a little earlier, lots of journals have now made themselves completely open as a response to COVID, and there's lots of open educational resources that professors can easily integrate into their classes. And that, I guess, goes again with undergraduate research. It can now happen anywhere in the world. The Maple Leaf campuses are so small and remote, which is an awesome benefit, but can pose challenges when talking about community partners. But now those work study partners or undergraduate research partners can really be anywhere globally. And the Maple Leaf's Ripen platform can help connect students to those opportunities. And lastly, learning communities. And I think this is the biggest thing that can come out of COVID is when everything's in the virtual, you can reach anyone. So not only are you able to connect with people on your own campus, but students at all Maple Leaf universities, or really students across the world who have similar interests, can connect and deepen their learning. So all that to say is that yes, high impact practices can seem super daunting, but I think there's a way to reimagine them now in the light of COVID. And in that, if we keep equitable design at the forefront, more students can participate and the benefits can really span better and more impactful than they were before. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you to all of our panelists for that great introduction. I feel like we can just wrap it up there and go home. Just kidding. I have a few more thought-provoking questions to hopefully draw out some next steps for us. It seems a constant theme here is the importance of high-impact practices in light of COVID, but also under normal circumstances to create a more accessible and accommodative classroom, and also one that engages students with each other and builds their support, builds their networks. But it still leaves us students, yes, wanting to contribute, but I feel there's a question in mind, how can students best advocate for and know what high impact practices are going to be the most effective in their classroom?
I think, Brendan, your question really comes down to two different parts, actually, is, how do we identify what is the, right high impact practice for us, but then also as students and student leaders, how do we kind of advocate for a more inclusive university and different abilities overall? And so I think with the first part, I think it really is situational. And I think that we have to start having more conversations about what do students want to see in their classrooms. But then on the flip side, talking with profs and seeing really what are their dreams and aspirations on what they want to see happening at their institutions at a departmental level, an individual level, and an institutional level. And that's something that hopefully we're going to hone out a little bit in our research coming up. But then on the other side of that is kind of the second part that you mentioned is as students and as student leaders, what can we do? And the people from St. FX know that I'm a professional constructive complainer to the university administration, as I call it at this point. And really, it comes down to students know best what students want. And that's something that maybe sometimes we tend to forget because we think, oh, I'm just one student, so what really does it mean? But students' voices are the most powerful voices on any single campus. So just trying to understand, like I said, I shared my slides, so you can do some reading if you want. There's enough there to keep you busy for a week, I promise. But just having conversations and being able to translate those conversations into different action items, which I think we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Can I ask a question to Tiffany and Tanisha and maybe the other students on the call about Tiffany's statement about students know how they learn? What would you say to a faculty member? Because I've had lots of conversations with faculty members who say, no, students just want 2 papers and a final exam. Students want the cookie cutter. And there's lots of research to support that, especially high achieving students. There's this one research article that I read about high achieving students are more reticent to changing and to adapting to high impact practices, and are willing to short circuit their own creativity in order to get a higher grade. And that, when I read that, I almost cried, because the reason why we're here is supposed to be, transforming and growing and having that difficulty of that learning process. And yet, as Krista points out, as institutions, we're pretty hierarchical, we're somewhat transactional. We are still in a process of you do something and we give you a grade, right? So there are some real constraints at the institutional level about this. So Tiffany and Tanisha, and then maybe out to the group, what would you say to faculty members who said, well, I tried something really innovative or really playful and they hated me and they killed me in my teaching evaluations?
Don't mind. I did take a few notes as I believe Krista and Jessica were speaking earlier, especially on the point where faculty aren't really trained on sort of HIPs and how to integrate and change things, especially when you're of a minority group as a professor. It's really tricky. And so I guess one of the first steps would be bringing awareness that this is an option, but however, it's not really enough just to have awareness, but maybe to implement it as part of the professors' trainings when they come on board to these universities, to say that, okay, listen, when you're making your syllabus, you should try to find a way to create an option for the students, especially when they first come in, so they're probably taking more 100, 200 level courses, and create different paths for them so that they can kind of ease into how university is supposed to be preparing them for the workforce. And one way, I guess, path A could be more traditional. You have your essays, you have your midterms. Path B would be more HIPS oriented. And then path C can be kind of like a hybrid of the two. I don't really have a, I guess, solution per se on how to change the structure, but that is a suggestion that came to mind when I was thinking of the problems that were being brought up. And then looking further down, 300 level courses and up, we kind of take away that transitional element of path A where it's more traditional and tell them, okay, listen, it's going to be path B or C where it's either very HIPS oriented or slight hybrid, but no more just papers and midterms, to say that because it's really catering to that sort of mentality of, okay, what do I need to do to pass, as opposed to what is the information that I'm supposed to understand so that I can actually put it to use for later. So kind of shifting our way of learning that kind of was forced on us or shown to us back in like high school or SAGEP, depending on where you're coming from, where it's really like, okay, this is how much this paper is worth, this is how much the midterm will be worth, study. I think that we kind of have to find the way to integrate the models from the 100, 200 levels and then really enforce it in 300 and up. That's really all I can think of at the moment.
I think you hit on something really important, Tanisha, and that is structured reflection. So we need to be careful about how we structure reflection so that it is accessible and that it isn't against the goals of trying to kind of move the deep learning forward. And there are some articles available about kind of structured reflection and what that looks like. And the other piece, I think, switching gears a little bit, is reflection means a level of vulnerability. Whether it's personal reflection or critical reflection, you are in the picture. You are, as a student learner, you are there and you are a live participant and you are no longer an observer. And I think that is a mindset and a shift that students welcome, but sometimes makes professors and educators more uncomfortable. And students too, sometimes, let's fully disclose.
I have a point to that as well. I'll chime in now, Krista. When you speak of this inherent vulnerability and reflection and in creating the students into live participants, my 2 cents on this as a student and seeing from my peers is in-course feedback forms and evaluations. When that is supposed to be the opportunity to make these proper suggestions, here's where this could fit in, here's where you could evolve your practices, assessments, it is never delivered, or students never have the mindset going into these forums that they can actually affect tangible change. It's always, well, our quizzes were worth 15%, we should make them worth 10%, or you should have better informed us about the material of this assessment beforehand. It's always something, just minor tweaks. And I think this is a beginning of hopefully positive change on that note, but in encouraging the students, empowering the students to take hold of their own education, saying, no, look, here are some positive changes that we can affect, and maybe even demonstrating high impact practices at the institution, so then they are more properly encouraged and informed to take this leadership role in communicating with professors, giving feedback, and properly reflecting.
Can I pop in there and just sort of say that I agree that we ask at the wrong time of the course for an assessment of the course, right? So there's so many problems with teaching evaluations because they happen at the very end. They, depending on the question, our Bishop's teaching evaluation right now doesn't ask students if they learned anything. But we do ask how the AV material was. So that's a problem. But I think that goes back to Krista and Tanisha's point about that constant feedback cycle, that we can start that much earlier and work it through that term so that we can be responsive and co-design. And to be able to support our faculty, but also our students about what is appropriate feedback, right? What does good, constructive, productive feedback look like? What is helpful? What is generous of spirit? And what is not helpful? I got a teaching comment a few years ago that said the room was too cold. There's nothing I can do with that, but there is something I can do with these sort of regular weekly pulse checks and critical reflections about, hey, we're going too fast, or hey, I'd love to go down this rabbit hole, or can we bring in a secondary source? So we can do that kind of work if we're doing that critical reflective feedback. But in all fairness to both faculty and students, we don't train people on how to do critical reflection, and we don't value it, right? We don't know how to assess it, assign it, and assess it. And so a few years ago, I did this learning journal where our students kept a running learning journal to do critical reflective practice. And one of the students said, well, I can't tell the difference between an opinion piece, an argumentation, and a critical reflective practice. So we had to stop and talk about some of those design principles, and I had to model it too. I had to go and be like, okay, here's the messiness of this critical reflective practice. So to be fair to everybody, we don't really teach it, we don't train for it, and we don't assess it very well. Even though we know it's a key piece of high impact practices, we can do this part a lot better.
I just put a comment in the chat saying, I think that's a really good point, and that definitely gives me something to really think about, like where we would take that and how we'd mobilize that and move that forward, and that's a valuable piece.
I have a couple questions from the chat, and Sarah, I'll let you jump the line because you need to go to another meeting. So I have Sarah, and then a question from Aaron Austin, and then Andrew Nurse had one that I can get him to speak to in a second. Sarah?
Hello, I don't know why my video camera won't turn on. This is my first time ever using Blue Jeans. It's really cool, but I'll just jump right to my question. First of all, thank you everybody for being here and willing to answer my questions. So in Tiffany's PowerPoint, she talked about how people of color really benefit from these experiential learning opportunities. And I was just wondering, we have these experiential learning opportunities at SignFX. Obviously, like, we can expand on them and make them better. But how do we get them more accessible so more people that are BIPOC can be in these positions and gain these experiential learning experiences? So if you have any suggestions, just things that I can bring back to our own institution and kind of help more BIPOC people have these experiences.
So thanks, Sarah, for your question. And kind of like I mentioned, that's one of the things that in the States, there's a lot of literature, and I'll send you some stuff afterwards, so don't worry, girl, I got you. But in our own institutions, these things aren't really kind of studied or looked at as closely or in maybe so much of a cohesive way. So I think right now, I think the takeaway is that we need to be having these conversations more and more with these groups of people. So for SignFX campus, for example, where Sarah is from, we have our Diversity Engagement Center, and it's with the advisor of African descent students and with the advisor of Indigenous students that we need to be having these conversations, but also bringing it down to a student level. Because like I said earlier, students know what works and doesn't work for them. And so there might be barriers that we have no idea about because there's really only American literature versus something that even just ensuring that people know about these things happening, that could really make a difference in the participation rates from our students.
Thank you, Tiff.
I'm looking for Aaron's question, sorry. No. Aaron asked, do any universities have a way to identify which courses include high impact practices? I will append to this. Is there something we should be focusing more on here in terms of sharing success stories of high impact practices? I think so. I love hearing about them.
I think, Tiffany, you're probably the best situated. She's just done an environmental scan of the 4 institutions about what high impact practices are happening on campus, who knows about them, and who's participating in them. Do you want to give them a spoiler alert from your research for your environmental scan?
A quick spoiler alert from stuff not yet published is that the quick answer is no. We don't really have a good way across the 4 universities of understanding who's doing what and where and when and who knows about it. So in my dream world, we're going to get to a point where maybe we have a repository or even just generalized knowledge about where these different actions are happening. But as of right now, the quick answer is no. And I believe that we do need to be doing much, much better jobs at translating this knowledge to students overall, because if we don't know what's happening, if staff and faculty don't know what's happening, students sure don't either. So
yeah, I love that. And I love that Brendan, you just sort of suggested one of the next steps or steps going forward is to create case studies and make that visible and share that a little bit more widely and broadcast that. Yeah.
So with the last few minutes of this panel, I'll open it up to our speakers and students if you'd like to contribute. In terms of the next steps, and like Jessica just said, we're hearing the importance of sharing these stories in the chat right now is certainly just the discussion of proper reflection throughout courses and assessment of those. And then I'm also hearing from Krista and others important points such as speaking to other students, speaking to professors, what are challenges faced in your course design, and what can be done better. So opening that to the panel, what can students do to really take hold of high impact practices at their institution and support this change?
I'll hop in very quickly, Brendan. Thanks for the question. I think there is a communications gap for sure. And again, when students are demanding more of their institutions in this current context, it provides an opportunity to remedy that gap. So like Tiffany said in one of her recommendations, not only making the work of faculty visible, because there are faculty definitely on all campuses that are doing all of these things. If the department, I think it starts at a departmental level, but then it can also scale up towards the university level. If it's not visible, how are students to know? And how are, like, then it gets into that equity piece where it's the knows and the don't knows. Like, it's segregated again with students who have had an amazing experience, can use their social networks to share that, but it, you know, can leave behind some students as well. So I think it can begin with a communications piece from the faculty, from the department, and then scale outwards. And that's where student advocates and student leaders can really join in and push for this change and publicize what the good work that's already happening on our campuses.
Can I also say that I think the other thing is it has to be an encouraging kind of opt-in approach. And so a tool where academics who want to engage can showcase what they're doing, as opposed to something that is a mandatory kind of must do. And so I think if we built a tool, you know, if you build it, they will come. That kind of idea that if we came up with something, the folks who are doing it would participate because they want to showcase what they're doing. And I think that's kind of an approach I would suggest.
And can I just echo that, you know, faculty from across age, stage, and discipline, when they see things, they get inspired. And so I know, you know, a number of faculty who are in their, you know, the final decade of their teaching career, who are just so open to breaking open and to trying something new, but are maybe not entirely sure about the design principles, just as much as our junior faculty are like, okay, how do I leap into this? How do I do these sort of wonderful, interesting things that I will engage students with? But I think the key is consent, a menu of choices, a series of resources for individualized support as people want to dip their toes in, and to never make anything mandatory, because as soon as you do that, you take away people's autonomy and choice, right? So putting it there, as Krista says, making it visible, encouraging, and creating these generative spaces to inspire both faculty and students as partners to do this work.
All right. Lauren, I suppose this will be our last question before I encourage you all to fill out our feedback form, and then we'll wrap it up. Are there ways to apply high impact practices to student governance to better involve and represent the general student body? I would argue that a lot of these points we can take the lead on and lead by example. I'll keep that open to the panel.
Yeah, I can hop in on that one really quickly too, because this is something that based off one of the last Better Together sessions I've been thinking about a lot actually is how do we use our organizations that we have availability to right now, like the student unions, to start promoting these things more. And if I look at, for example, the St. FX Student Union, like I said, I always use St. FX as my example. I have the ring. So if we look at the St. FX Student Union, right now they're really talking about how do we increase or better, I guess, our bar services, and how do we better our marketing? And why are we not using our classes to maybe make groups and plans and challenges on how do we do marketing plans and marketing proposals and all of these things? So there's really easy ways, even things like governance. People are rewriting bylaws every day. We have, I think every school in the 4 have public policy and different political sciences, and I'm sure these are things that they would be interested in. So I think from a student governance level too, it's about reaching out to the resources that are around you and to the professors that can help you really quickly.